I have whittled down a larger presentation about imposter syndrome into something that we can digest and present in about 55 minutes time. I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end as well for some questions and answers. I do unfortunately have to get off the call right at the top of the hour to attend my next call. But I always encourage folks to reach out to me if you have any questions, if there's a question that you didn't want to ask in front of the group, if you need some more help or personal guidance. I will definitely share my email address with you on the last slide, and you are free to just reach out to me via my personal email. I always love hearing from folks. So let me share my PowerPoint here. All right, Brooke, thumbs up if you can see this. Fantastic, thank you very much. I always have that little moment of fear, like what if I just start babbling on and nobody can see my slides? As Brooke mentioned, I'm a licensed mental health counselor, also oftentimes referred to as therapist or psychotherapist, and a board certified coach. And coaching, my business is Courageous Artistry. Coaching allows me to reach people all over the country, actually all over the world. I have clients in many different countries, and I work with a really interesting mix of people. I find it a lot of fun, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So throughout today's presentation, I've peppered a few quotes from prominent figures that I hope will help you feel more normal, will help you see that even very fancy and accomplished folks out there in the world oftentimes feel imposter syndrome. So I really loved this quote from Maya Angelou. I will probably occasionally look in the chat box, just FYI, to see if anything big is going on. But Brooke, if somebody has a question or somebody's hand is raised so that I can't see, feel free to unmute yourself and just let me know, and we can pause really quickly. I don't like to do that if there's 200 people in the Zoom room, but with just a handful of us, that's absolutely fine with me.
Will do.
Thank you. It's a little bit about me. Along with being a therapist and a coach, my first career was in music. I am a professional opera singer, and I still perform quite regularly. Performance is a big part of my life and career. And it was these two sort of different paths in my life and my career that led me to feel very passionately about working with individuals who really want to be at the top of their game. All these things I already told you. I call myself currently a high performance coach for professionals in the public eye, but sometimes I refer to myself as a public speaking coach. Sometimes I say I help people manage their anxiety around workplace issues and performance. And I work with a lot of attorneys, I work with performing artists, I work with some professional athletes, I work with entrepreneurs. So I have a really broad range of cool folks that I get to help. And I think that conquering imposter syndrome is one of the things that I probably speak about most commonly. And this is across the board, right? This doesn't matter if you are a professional football referee or soccer goalie, or you are a person who is making their Broadway debut, or you are an entrepreneur or a professor, let's say, or a doctor, right? This applies to most of us at some points in our lives. I call my business Courageous Artistry because I believe that even those of us who don't perhaps consider ourselves to be artists or performing artists all have an artistry to what we do, right? And we need to learn how to just courageously embrace that side of ourselves. So some brief goals for today. I'd like to speak about how do we define imposter syndrome, figure out some of the shared traits and personal characteristics, figure out some of the dangers and what we would call comorbidities. What are coexisting mental or health issues or problems that might lead us to be more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome? Talk about some strategies for treatment, some brief tips and tricks that I'd like to show you, and hopefully leave a little bit of time at the end for a question and answer. As I mentioned before, I have edited this down from a longer presentation. This is by no means exhaustive or the only way, but I like to design my 60-minute presentations really with a mind for what could most benefit the folks in this room today. What could give them some great impact? What could be some strong messages or tips or tricks that they could walk away with and really learn to practice in their own lives? Here's another great quote from the author John Steinbeck. All right. What is imposter syndrome? Sometimes it's referred to as imposter phenomenon. Well, the very official version of this is that it's a pervasive psychological experience of a person believing they are a self-perceived intellectual fraud and fearing they may be recognized as an imposter. You may have noticed when I read this quote that I emphasized the words believing and also the phrase self-perceived, or the concept self-perceived. So there's a belief structure behind imposter syndrome and a perception that is going on, which is so important to remember. We'll get into that a little bit more later. In academic literature, the term is more often coined imposter phenomenon. But in the lay literature, we talk about imposter syndrome. So that's what we're going to stick with for today. So important to note is that imposter syndrome is not a diagnosable condition. And according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors like myself use to create a mental health diagnosis, psychologists and others do acknowledge that it is a very real and specific form of intellectual self-doubt, which occurs amongst high achievers who are unable to internalize and accept their success. And a lot of these folks also suffer in silence. Part of I think one of the main issues with imposter syndrome is perhaps the loneliness embedded within the feeling, in that, oh gosh, if I even told you how much of an imposter I think I am right now, then I'd be called out. The ruse would be up, jig is up. You would know that I really don't know what I'm talking about. So this is a very silent condition for the most part. And, a lot of maybe more of the uncomfortable feelings tend to really kind of thrive in silence. They can really grow and fester if we let them. So let's think now some of the traits and characteristics of people, professionals like yourselves, who report feeling like frauds. I'd really just like you to maybe you could even type something in the chat box. I'll pull it up. What are some of the traits that we might see commonly in folks who feel like they are frauds? I know before I mentioned already the phrase high performing, right? These tend to be high performing individuals. Does anything else come up to anybody's mind? And if not, that's fine. We can just move right on. Perfectionists, competitive. Yes, thank you. Definitely. I think we see that one a lot. Highly self-critical is one we tend to see. So here are some demographics that we know of as of yet. Now, the research around this is somewhat murky. I would just like to point out. I do have a references slide at the end of this if you're curious, but I think just from a felt perspective or a lived perspective, our lived knowledge tends to tell us that women and also minority populations are likely to suffer from higher levels of imposter syndrome. Much of the early research, interestingly, was focused on women exclusively. As you may know from some of the scientific literature, medical research, etc., it's pretty rare that any study is focused solely on women, right? We tend to really kind of be the redheaded stepchildren of the research world where, especially the medical community by and large for many, many decades now, it's shifting slightly, has just sort of viewed women as like small men. And they'll do a bunch of research on a drug, a medication, and they'll just extrapolate that likely it's going to work on women as well. So I find that point kind of interesting. In 2020, a study found that 9 to 82% of people experience imposter syndrome. Wow, that's a really broad range, isn't it? I think once again, this, at least for my mind, points to perhaps further research needing to be done on this. And once again, studies are inconclusive as to whether imposter syndrome declines with age. I know for myself and also for many of my clients, for some of us, it doesn't actually matter how accomplished we are outwardly. The phrase I like to use with my clients is new level, new devil. That when we, leap to in the next rung of the ladder in our professional life, let's say, We may feel more confident. We may say, oh, I've got all this experience behind me, or I'm getting older, I'm in this decade of life now, therefore I am more established, more confident, more experienced, etc. But oftentimes being in a new scenario where stakes are higher, where maybe more eyeballs are on us, can lead to sudden feelings of imposter syndrome, even when we were previously feeling fine. Let's think of some of the personal characteristics and traits now. So these researchers have summarized 6 characteristics that people suffering from imposter syndrome possess. We're going to start with number 1, which is actually kind of more of a cycle they go through. So confronting an achievement-related task leads to anxiety, self-doubt, and worry, which leads to over-preparation and or procrastination. Think to yourself as I'm listing all of these if you relate to any of these. Followed by the accomplishment of the task, right? So we might be the last minute, I do it at the stroke of midnight before the thing is due tomorrow. Or I might be the person who is over and over and over preparing, mulling it over, editing it, re-editing it, etc. Then we do the thing, we accomplish the task. Whew, we feel relieved, it's done. We receive positive feedback and we discount it. We do that old classic thing, that old chestnut of, oh, this old thing, oh, I found it on the street corner. Oh, this shirt, oh, got it out of the garbage, right? I'm exaggerating for effect right now, but we all know what I'm talking about. And then we perceive ourselves as fraudulent. Maybe we have some self-doubt again. We might feel feelings of sadness or anxiety. These may be, of course, when I use the phrases or the words depression or anxiety, we don't necessarily want to pathologize all of those feelings, right? Not all feelings of depression or anxiety warrant a diagnosis or treatment. But if we just think of them as within the full range of the human spectrum of emotions, depression/sadness, feeling blue, anxiety, worry, fear, these are all a very natural part of being a human. So yes, I'm looking at the chat box now. So Dr. LaFontana said the other duties as assigned activities where we have no training. Ooh, that tends to freak us out. Actually, there's a study I didn't quote in here that has shown that women who are applying for a job only will only apply to the job if they meet 95% of the qualifications. I might be misquoting this study, but ballpark, I think I'm correct. And men will tend to apply to a job even if they only meet 60% of the qualifications, which is very interesting, right? So in this, back to the over preparation and or procrastination, interestingly, oftentimes can be highly linked to perfectionism. And sometimes when I first say that to people, they kind of look at me like, huh? But let me explain it this way, and I think it'll make a lot of sense. If we are worried about not doing well, then we want to avoid facing that thing. So perfectionists can be over-preparers, but they can also be major procrastinators because they are trying to avoid the uncomfortable feelings that come up as they are preparing the new task, doing the speech, doing the presentation, etc. Whoops. Okay, here's some other personality characteristics. The need to be special or to be the very best. I know it resonates very deeply with me that somehow I have received the message through my family of origin, the culture, society around me, that if I'm not super special, then I'm not worth anything, right? That I have to be really, really good at all things in order to be worthy. We might find ourselves suffering from some superwoman or superman aspects where we get heavily into workaholism and overachievement, sometimes to the detriment of our own health, mental and physical. We tend to have a high fear of failure. And now, of course, all of these aspects could apply to almost any human out there. We may be very quick to deny our own competence or downplay it and to discount praise. It's interesting because you all are in Ohio, and this just kind of sticks out in my mind right now. I was having lunch with 2 business associates yesterday, 2 gentlemen, and we were talking about how they were both from Ohio. And now I do believe this applies to other parts of the country as well. But we had been having a discussion about bragging, quote unquote, bragging. And how when we are appearing confidently in front of a group of people, let's say it's a networking function and you're talking about your business or what you do, that oftentimes, and this can be highly even sort of region specific, they said, oh gosh, these two gentlemen said, oh, growing up in Ohio, we were taught never, ever, ever to brag and to always downplay your achievements. Right. So I think that just came to my mind today, since, I'm guessing I'm talking to a group from Ohio. I don't know if any of you relate to that. I relate to it as well. But I think we can think about different regions of the country, some of whom have more of the ethos of, keep your head down, work hard, never talk about your accomplishments. And then other parts of the country where it may be more highly encouraged. Right. And this can get down into further smaller groups within society. But yeah, a lot of us have trouble stating what we're good at and stating it in a matter of fact manner. We tend to feel like that's somehow bragging. So therefore, when somebody says, wow, you did a really great job, brava, go you right away think, ooh, must be humble, must reject praise, must not brag. Bragging equals bad. Bragging equals arrogant. We may, along the same lines, have a lot of fear and guilt about our success. Strangely, or maybe not so strangely to some of you, many of us, of course, have fear of failure. But I would say I work with almost just as many people who have a fear of success, where when they do finally step into a more successful realm or reach that higher level of their career or that salary level, whatever it may be, that oftentimes they can have feelings of fear and guilt that they reached that success. So here's some other personality types outlined by another researcher, and I find these kind of interesting too. Sometimes we feel like we must be the expert, that we have to know absolutely everything about a subject. And if we don't, we have major imposter syndrome. We may be the perfectionist, and we're focusing on absolutely unattainable outcomes or goals. Of course, we can see where expert and perfectionist really dovetail with one another as concepts as well. We may suffer from the phenomenon of feeling like we have to be a natural genius, that if we have to master new skills quickly. We're not allowed to kind of be caught working on something or struggling with something. If we have to, oftentimes we feel ashamed or we feel weak. This can happen a lot to folks who have been considered to be bright. I'll put all of these in heavy air quotes because they do have some baggage around them. To be considered bright or gifted or intelligent. If you were a child who was labeled smart, that can bolster our self-esteem in some ways, but it can also lead us to then feel like we have to be really good at everything because we've received this label. Therefore, we can't be struggling in any area. The soloist or the rugged individualist. This is the type of person who feels like they're not allowed to ask for help. If they can't do everything on their own, then somehow they're failing. They're an imposter. So I really liked all of those personality types, and I know that I can see a version of myself in every single one of them. I also liked this quote from Sheryl Sandberg, the COO, I believe, or the former COO of Facebook and Meta. Likely one of the most typically successful women in our country. So let's talk about some of the other aspects that are going on with us, either physically or emotionally, that may cause us to feel higher than average levels, or let's maybe call them, once again, I don't want to use the word pathological or to pathologize anything here, because this is truly, as far as I'm concerned, just a part of being human. And since I believe we might all be women in the group here, although I don't know how anybody identifies, this is something that I think we all can relate to. So once again, while it is not an official diagnosis, it may lead to or already exist in people that are already experiencing perhaps high levels of anxiety or a true anxiety disorder, someone who has low self-esteem or problems with their self-worth, self-confidence, We may see this more likely in people who struggle with depressive disorders, because folks who suffer from depressive disorders tend to have overall, low feelings or less worthy feelings about themselves. We may see this in folks who tend towards burnout. We may see this in folks who have a lack of job satisfaction. If we are in a job, perhaps, that is not a great fit for us for whatever reason, we may be suffering from imposter syndrome more often. I find it interesting that there is a bit of a recent push to include imposter syndrome as an official diagnosis. I, for one, am once again not about the pathologizing of anything really, and sometimes I feel deeply uncomfortable with some of the diagnostic categories that we have for people. However, one of the benefits of a diagnosis is that if something is officially diagnosed and put into a manual, we can study it and codify it. And that's not something that we can do as easily prior to there being a diagnosis, which may also be the reason why some of the research on imposter syndrome is so inconclusive. So I just wanted to share that little tidbit. Now let's talk through just a couple strategies of how we might begin to cope with imposter syndrome. Once again, this is not an exhaustive list. My imposter syndrome, I'll call myself out here, flares up when I give a 60-minute presentation and I really feel like I have to give everybody all the tools and tips and tricks. Otherwise, I haven't done a good job. So for me to edit things down and to take out things that I find valuable really triggers my own imposter syndrome. So I'll just out myself here as a fellow human who suffers from this. I like this concept from a preeminent, I believe he's a psychologist or probably a psychiatrist, who does a lot in the field of mindfulness. And I think that this is a really kind of nice little tidbit. In fact, interestingly, I was talking on the phone this morning with a friend about some work struggles that she's going through. And I hadn't even put these two pieces together. And she said, this past weekend, I really used the name it to tame it strategy. She hadn't even gotten that from me. She had gotten it from somewhere else. And she said, I really just tried to focus on my feelings that I was feeling about my workplace issue and really to name them to myself over and over and over again. So I thought that was kind of a cool coincidence that a friend of mine just mentioned this strategy this morning on the phone to me. So name it to tame it is just a strategy, very simple, quick and easy, where you yourself describe your internal state to yourself, or perhaps to someone else if you care to, without, let me emphasize that word, without rationalizing it or explaining what you are feeling. So it is more, okay, Ingela, you're feeling really anxious about XYZ situation. You're feeling imposter syndrome about this aspect of X, Y, and Z recently. And it's not then continuing on to say, and you're feeling this because you're really not as good as da 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 da, da as you would like to be, right? We're not justifying, we're not rationalizing, we're just noticing. Just a very mindful strategy. We're noticing the emotion that comes up. I feel imposter syndrome right now. Don't even go into the why. Very often our brain quickly wants to go into the why of everything. My personal take on this is our brain likes to fool us into thinking that if it can find the why for things, that it doesn't have to deal with feeling bad. Newsflash, we're all going to feel bad sometimes, right? But I think our brain can be really tricky oftentimes in trying to help us escape from the bad feelings. And it believes that if we can just find a why or rationalize it, that we might be able to dispel these uncomfortable emotions. It's a very human characteristic not to want to suffer, right? Now, of course, sometimes finding the why might give us some important insight, but in this strategy, we're just labeling without judgment. So, an example might be, right now I notice my thoughts racing and an anxious feeling in the pit of my stomach. I'm going to get a little bit into maybe more rich concept called attributional styles, or sometimes also referred to as explanatory styles. This is just a fancy way of saying how we speak to ourselves about what's going on in the world, how we are attributing or explaining events to ourselves. This is what's called attributional style or explanatory style. And we all are constantly doing this, whether we realize it or not. We are giving value judgments on ourselves in the world, on the world, other people in the world, and we are attributing things or explaining things to ourselves in our own sort of language of our brain, our cognitive sphere. And we all have a style in which we are doing this. So some of us, and there's likely a mix of everything here, are engaging in explanatory styles that are very negative, or perhaps lean more towards the negative. Or if we're lucky, or if we have had some training in this, we might have a more positive or optimistic, explanatory style. So what we want to be aware of is that we can have different types of explanatory styles. They can be stable versus unstable, which refers to permanence. I know this is sounding all a little bit psychobabblish right now, but I'm going to get into it more. We can have global versus specific, which is pervasiveness. Whoops, and I guess I had something out of order there. So there's 3 dimensions of explanatory styles. And we can have internal versus external. I knew that slide looked funny. Make a little note to myself to fix that slide. Did the animations wrong there. So this is according to the researcher and psychologist Martin Seligman, who has done a lot of incredibly valuable research and is one of the founding fathers of a branch of psychology that's called positive psychology. So he's done a lot of, like I said, very, very valuable work. And in fact, if you have never heard of the book Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman, I highly suggest you check it out because this is where he really explains a lot about these attributional or explanatory styles. So let's get into what all of these mean. So first, explanatory style, personalization. This is internal versus external. So this is when we are sort of figuring out in our own minds, is this specific outcome caused by factors that are inside of me, so by me personally, or is this caused by factors outside of me? Is this impersonal to myself? Now, not everything exists on a super neat binary, of course. There can be aspects of both. But if we are speaking to ourselves and we are making everything very personal, oh, it's my fault, I was bad, I messed up, they don't like me, then we might say we have a very internal personalization style. So, right, these people who tend to blame failure on their internal factors or who attribute success, this is the opposite side of the coin, to external factors, we would say that they have a more negative or pessimistic explanatory style. So this is when something happens, and if it's bad, it's all my fault. And if it's good, it's because somebody else did something, or it's just a coincidence. I think we can all probably recognize ourselves in this, right? And here's the sort of sentence that gives an example. If I did well, it's due to luck. If I did poorly, it's my fault. That would be an example of a negative or pessimistic explanatory style referred to as personalization, where we are internalizing failures and externalizing successes. Now for permanence. So they call these the 3 Ps: personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. Permanence, is a situation changing across time, or is it fixed? Is it stable? Is it permanent? This can be a stable versus unstable issue, and I'll get into more of what that means. Individuals who tend to view negative life events as things that will persist indefinitely have a more negative or pessimistic explanatory style. So something happens, and the way we talk to ourselves about it is with the language, oh, this is going to be terrible forever, and it's always going to be bad. I will always be bad, right? Where we're thinking about the timeline of a thing. So an example of this is, if this doesn't turn out well, it is likely to keep happening. But, and here's the opposite, the flip side of the coin, but if it turns out well, it will be temporary. So we attribute, once again, successes or good things to, oh, that's just temporary, it's fleeting, there's no way that could stick around. But if we fail at something, or something fails, if we don't feel like we did well on some presentation or paper or aspect of our job, and it didn't turn out as well as we would like, we tend to make that a permanent attribute. Now for the third P, pervasiveness. Pervasiveness can be what we call either global or specific. And that would be the expectation that negative events will occur in other aspects of life, right? If you just think about the word or the concept of pervasiveness, it's not just about this one thing, it's going to bleed over into everything else. So individuals who tend to attribute an outcome to a factor they perceive as consistent, irrespective of context, have a more negative or pessimistic explanatory style. So once again, this is, things are gonna, if it happens badly here, it's gonna affect everything else, right? If things are bad in this situation, it will also affect other areas of my life. But if things are good, then they will only affect one specific area. Interesting, right? I'm hoping that some of you are feeling a little called out by this in some of your self-talk, because if you're feeling a little called out, if you're feeling a little bit, oof, ouch, that's me, I do that sometimes, then it would perhaps behoove you to take a look at not only the book Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman, but perhaps some other positive psychology literature to figure out, and this is a question I often ask my clients, if they come to me and they say something has been troubling them, I will sometimes see that there's an example of one of the three P's happening, right? And we'll figure out, are you making this more permanent than it needs to be? Are you perhaps speaking to yourself in a way that's making this more pervasive than it needs to be? Or, this is, I think, maybe the most common one, are you making this more personal than it needs to be? Another great concept that applies to imposter syndrome, and this is another book that I absolutely love by Dr. Carol Dweck. These two books that I'm mentioning are absolute, some of the, I think, most important books in psychology. Her book was called Mindset. And if you haven't checked out the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, I highly suggest you check it out. So she has done a ton of research and spawned a lot of research onto the concept of mindset. We talk about mindset a lot now in educational circles. So for those of you who are in higher ed or any type of education, you've likely heard this concept before, but I'm going to outline it anyways, because I think it's very important. I catch myself still doing it all the time. So if we have a fixed mindset about something, we believe that our abilities or our attributes are fixed and unchangeable. Oh, I'm just bad at that thing. Oh, I don't have any talent there, right? I'm no good at X, Y, or Z. So we're speaking to ourselves in a way, in our self-talk, in our interpretation of our experience in the world, ourselves in the world, as if all of these attributes are fixed and unchangeable. Very important to remember, right? I'm just not good at that. I was never good at X. I don't have any ability in X. But when we can encourage ourselves to be in more of a growth mindset, that is the belief that our abilities can be developed. And I will tell you folks, I've thought about this concept a lot and really pondered, is there anything in the world that we cannot have a growth mindset about? Well, maybe there are a few things. I am 5'3" and unlikely to be getting any taller unless some miracle occurs. I was born with brown eyes and brown hair and the name Ingela, although I suppose the name Ingela could be changed legally if I wanted it to, right? I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Of course, there are facts about me that cannot be changed, but there are many things that we will view as fixed qualities or characteristics, and we will forget that our brains as humans are highly plastic, highly moldable. We can grow, we can learn new things. If you see the way children are, they are like little whirlwinds of growth, right? And when we get into our adult years, we tend to be more fixed, and we tend to want to challenge ourselves less oftentimes. We tend to have a more fixed mindset about who we are in the world and what our abilities are. Some of this might not be bad, but I would encourage you to think, what of this could I maybe leave behind? So, a typical growth mindset statement would be, even though I'm not as great at blah, blah, blah as I would like to be, I bet you if I devote some time and energy to it, or if I get some support in it, I get help with it, I talk to a mentor, I see a coach, etc., I can improve this thing. And actually, once again, there's very little that we cannot improve if we really put our minds to it. So I don't want to talk about growth mindset in a way that makes it sound like, oh, in order to conquer imposter syndrome, just get really perfect and good at everything. And then you'll no longer feel that way. So let's not play that game either. We don't want to use these concepts against ourselves. But when I'm working with my clients, what I really encourage them to do is to find different language with which to speak to themselves about any given topic. So I'll share a client recently who she made her Broadway debut a few weeks ago. Very, very exciting, right? As her coach, I was absolutely thrilled. She had been struggling from some mindset issues and had kind of taken a few hard knocks in her career prior to making this Broadway debut. Now, I was able to listen to a video of her Broadway debut that was posted on YouTube by a fan in the audience. I thought she sounded like $1 million. She sounded so amazing. But I was curious to hear her take on it. So when she talked to me after the debut, not knowing that I had already listened to her, she said, I just feel like I'm still struggling with X, and I'm not good enough at this, and I'm not good enough in this way. So I pointed out to her that, at least in my humble opinion, I thought she did a fantastic job. And can she find a way to speak to herself about this debut in a way that is less harmful and painful to herself, while still leaving room for the fact that she's a human who wants to grow and improve her abilities, right? She's trying to be at the absolute top of her game in a highly competitive environment. So we were able to find some phrases for her, such as, although I wasn't feeling as grounded as I would like to feel in the week where I sang my first 3 shows, I know with some time and utilizing some different skills, I can feel more grounded, right? Or maybe she was able to say, although my voice wasn't exactly where I want it to be in this stressful situation, likely no one from the outside is judging me as harshly as I am judging myself, right? So these would be really growth mindset ways to speak about things, as if our abilities are, well, in that one, she also used depersonalization and impermanence, right? She didn't make it pervasive. So all this to say, these are subtle gradations of learning how to speak to ourselves. That's not just about positive affirmations, but about recognizing that we may have areas that we want to grow and change. And those areas are able to be worked on because we have this amazing brain that can grow and change, while at the same time, this is sort of this gray zone here, right? While at the same time, not being so hard on ourselves that nothing short of perfect is acceptable whatsoever. Okay, here's a references slide where I mentioned some of these books that I talked about. If you are at all interested in any of these, like I said, the ones I would really suggest would be the Seligman here, Learned Optimism, and Carol Dweck, Mindset. These are just trade books. They're not research oriented. They're not academic books. Very easily readable. I would like to read the Valerie Young book. Haven't read it yet. I can always put that back up if you would like. So now we have about 20 minutes left, and I might be able to actually go more deeply into some concepts, but I would love to open some things up here to some conversation, and also to say to you that, here is all of my information. You can feel free to email me at this. In fact, Brooke, if you wouldn't mind putting my email also in the chat box, ingela@courageousartistry.com. I would love to speak with any of you via email if you care to. And we can also connect on LinkedIn. I would love that. I love hearing from people and connecting with them. Or connect with me on social media if you want to see other things that I'm up to and other opportunities that you might be able to take advantage of. But yes, and I will. Thank you for putting that in there, Brooke. So now I'm going to maybe give it just another moment, but I would love to sort of open up a wider conversation to hear, what are some of you struggling with? What are some of the reasons that you tuned in to this presentation today? What did you relate with? What relate to? What did you not relate to? What are some struggles that you have perhaps overcome and some wisdom that you can share with the group here? And you can just feel free to unmute. No need to raise your hand or anything like that.
I think it was interesting in Donna's response in the chat where she was saying that, women are sometimes expected to feel as though they're imposters.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that comment interesting too. And I'm glad we have time to talk about it now. Um, yeah, I wonder, and I don't know enough about that particular research to know, was it female researchers that were having a hunch about their own experiences? Was it male researchers making assumptions? Um, there are obviously a lot of staggeringly negative um, research and studies that show, not only that we as women earn less, right, to a man's dollar, but also that we do suffer from more exclusion, perhaps bullying in the workplace, more silencing. So this does come down to some larger society, culture, gender issues. Um, I think it's very fascinating, sort of the pace at which all of this is blowing up. I mean, really, I think not only starting with the Me Too movement, but in the Me Too movement, a lot of things really were maybe dragged out into the light and are being looked at and assessed in different ways. But yeah, yeah, I agree with you, Donna. You said you feel like women might speak more about imposter syndrome than men. I agree with you too. I think that one benefit that we do have as women is that we are uh, more emotionally relational to one another. Typically, once again, broad strokes. I don't like generalizations because we're always going to find exceptions to the rule, but that we can maybe feel safer saying, hey, I'm really feeling like a fraud about this. And we can get support. And we can talk amongst one another, even just in a forum like today, right? Perhaps there would be some, when I've given talks like this in the past to a mixed group, I'd be curious to know, are there men or people who identify as men in the audience who are less likely to speak up if they are feeling this way? It's actually one of also the main reasons that I say, hey, reach out to me via email, because sometimes people won't say things in front of the group. So even in a scenario like this, where we're in a small room, I have no idea what relationship all of you have with one another, if any. You may be perfect strangers to one another. I have literally no clue. I have no context for any of this, which is fine by me. But would we feel theoretically more safe to talk about our own imposter syndrome in a group of strangers, or would we feel more safe in a group of trusted colleagues? Would we worry in a group of trusted colleagues that this information may somehow be used against us down the line? You think the pandemic might have contributed to this? Yeah, I think a lot of us felt a high amount of workaholism when we were at home during the pandemic. I know I am emerging from a phase of workaholism and noticing my own feelings of guilt around it. And for me, it's that name it to tame it strategy where I'm reminding myself that just because I set up this kind of breakneck pace of working during the pandemic doesn't mean that that's sustainable or healthy for me, and that it's okay for me to really call it quits at the end of the day and not go back and answer a few more emails, or not respond to a text message that's work related, etc. But yeah, I think the lines really got blurred, and for many of us during the pandemic, so many things in our lives fell away that work was really one of the identities in which we could dig more deeply. Oh, well, I don't, right? For myself, I mentioned before, I have a performance career that probably takes up about a quarter of my time, you know, generally in broad strokes. Well, all of my performing ended, of course. Nobody was performing. I didn't have any concerts coming up. Most of my life has been devoted to singing and music. And I no longer had that time. So what did I do? I filled it with business building strategies. Was that a good choice? I don't know. Maybe at the time it was a good choice for me to be able to fill that time with something that felt useful and meaningful. Um, but yeah, I think if we were, life, once again, at least for me, feels very busy and full. Lots of social engagements. I'm taking a trip with family this weekend, back to travel, all of the things. Um, Sometimes it's hard not to feel like I'm slacking off. And then when I am slacking off, I might then be led to feeling like an imposter, right? Oh, I didn't do a good job there because I didn't work hard enough on it. Oh my gosh, where do we draw the limits? Yeah. Anyone else? Anything that somebody in the room is perhaps currently facing or struggling?
I was just going to mention, I think when people get into high level executive positions, whether it's at a university or, in a corporation, sometimes I think it's the loneliness of being in that position, and feeling like you don't really have anybody to compare yourself to. And so, but that, you're being paid more, so you should be doing that much more, and
Mhm.
so it's easy to feel like, how did I get here? What's going on? Like, do these
Yeah.
people really think I know what I'm doing?
Right, right. Well, it's
So.
funny that you mentioned that because personal disclosure here, my husband is an academic, and just this year he took on the position of chair of his department, and his department has 70 faculty and staff. So he
Mhm.
went from being a professor of vocal performance, in which he was teaching one-on-one lessons to students and maybe one class per semester, right? So this very intimate relationship with his students, to suddenly being the CEO of his whole entire department. And yeah, even for him, um, the imposter syndrome has been real. He is really finding, and he would have no problem that I'm sharing this because A, you don't know him, and B, he's a very open guy. But we talk about it a lot. Suddenly he's expected to know how to do all of these things and run this. If we think of a university like a company of sorts,
Mhm.
to run a company and to manage a company that nobody ever gave him any training on, right? He does not have a degree in business. His doctorate is in music. There is very little overlap, right? So yeah, it can be lonely at the top. So we can achieve these higher and higher levels in our profession, and it's no guarantee, unfortunately, that we will feel confident, competent, supported, or that we will even feel like we can go get support. Because, we might think things like, well, who wants to hear the boss complaining about how hard it is to be a boss?
Yeah.
Right? Thank
Exactly.
you. Thank you for sharing that. I relate on a very personal level, as you can see.
There any other questions, comments?
And if not, that's okay too. I
Yeah.
know sometimes people are participating and they're just
Yeah.
being thoughtful and holding back and thinking. Perhaps, sometimes we're accomplishing a couple tasks at the same time and we can't be as fully engaged as we would like to be. I would maybe love to hear from those of you who feel like sharing, what is one thing that you might be able to work on going forward? Or what is one important concept that you'd like to keep in mind from today?
I appreciated the example of the singer where you were kind of redirecting how she should kind of speak to herself. I think that's something that, I think oftentimes as women, we tend to be very negative, very hard on ourselves. And I think being able to redirect the communication or the way we say something, I think is
Yeah,
important, is kind of my takeaway.
glad. Well, I'm glad you liked that. Anne Marie says having a growth mindset. And Donna says, name it to tame it. Yeah, these are complicated things because what we want to do as high performing professionals is we want to conquer something and, subjugate it and make it go away. And so much I believe about being a human in the world is about accepting that we will feel like this, but recognizing that feeling like this or thinking thoughts like this does not make them a fact. I often say to clients, thoughts are not facts and feelings are not facts. Now, are some thoughts facts? Of course, right? But feelings are not facts. So just because I feel like a fraud, just because I feel that I'm lacking confidence in this moment does not mean that everybody can see that or that I am being judged or estimated the same way by everybody. So we tend to get very myopic as humans and feel like, oh, the way I think and feel about X event is just the way it is. And oftentimes, and I challenge myself here, and sometimes I get on my husband's case too, because I recognize that if you are a person who has been traditionally successful in traditionally successful fields, maybe you have many advanced degrees, maybe you are very advanced in your profession, right? That there comes a type of intellectual confidence with that. And I think that intellectual confidence can sometimes be a double-edged sword because we're used to being the quote unquote smart person in the room with the answers. We're the expert on something. And so oftentimes we believe then every little thing our brain comes up with. Well, if I am smart and confident, then that must mean that everything I think is true and that I can read people's minds and that they're thinking this about me and that everybody thought this about my presentation. So we have to watch out that we don't want to use our own sort of intellectual capacity or our confidence in our own intellect and abilities against ourselves in that way. I think a lot of this is about this sort of almost like maybe we could even call it a spiritual distance, sort of in that more Zen way of taking a step back and realizing, okay, this may feel like the absolute truth to me, but this is just me in my own Ingela experience right now. And I actually have no way of knowing how it's appearing to the world. So I may as well find a kinder and more helpful and supportive way to speak to myself while still addressing the things that I consider to be growth areas, right? There are things that we all want to improve and work on. And I personally think that that makes life fun and interesting when we're on a growth and development trajectory. I'm guessing all of you have a similar outlook on that. Yet we don't want to make it so that these areas of growth are things we would like to improve, whether physical, mental, career, relationship, etc., mean that somehow we're failing or somehow we are bad or unworthy if they're not as good as we would like them to be. So yeah, Courtney says, realizing the positive thing happened, it'll be brief. Yep, the negative thing will be a black mark on me forever. Oof, I resonate with that one too, Courtney, that we tend to make the negative events permanent, pervasive, and personal. And we make the positive events impermanent, impersonal, and I guess what would be the opposite of pervasive? Specific, right? Oh, that's only for this one area. So watch out. And if you found that concept interesting, I highly suggest, once again, I'll type it in the chat box, Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. He has other great books too, but this is, I think, a book that I often gift to clients, that I suggest clients read. And none of us, even highly achieving people, are immune to some of this. So I'm all about what can we do to make our own internal lives a little bit easier so that life, which is hard enough as it is, doesn't have to be made harder by my own thoughts about myself. And now this is not the same as positive affirmations. I always like to point out positive affirmations are going to work for some of us, but in my mind, they actually don't work for a lot of us, because if they're too positive, then it's too big of a jump for our brain to make it there. So if I don't think I'm good at something and then I just look in the mirror and say, you're great at that, Ingela, what does my brain do? My brain goes, that's a load of crap. You don't, no, you're not. Why are you lying to yourself? So we have to find ways to speak to ourselves that encourage that growth mindset, recognizing there may be an issue I want to work on, but just because I'm not there yet doesn't mean I can't get there. And just because I'm not there yet doesn't mean I'm a terrible, horrible, awful person. It just means I'm a human being who has her areas in which she wants to kind of grow and change. So yeah. Well, I thank you all for being a great audience and for your meaningful comments and for your attention. And I will look forward to seeing you all, or some of you perhaps, next month for the Zoom Confidence webinar. That one maybe could have come out earlier in the pandemic, but we're all still Zooming a lot. And I think there's some good tips and tricks, really practical stuff. This one's going to be a very applicable presentation versus maybe a deeper, more psychological presentation like today, where you're going to walk away and say, oh, now I understand a little bit better about how I can use Zoom to my, best benefit.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next month at the next webinar.
Wonderful. Feel free to
Great.
get
Thank
in
you.
touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.